If you were to step into the dusty plains of ancient Egypt, the first thing that might strike you is the endless fields of wheat and barley stretching toward the horizon. Not the grand temples or golden statues you imagine in glossy history books, but the subtle, constant presence of grain, the backbone of Egyptian civilization. Grain was more than food. It was the measure of life itself, a unit of survival, wealth, and status. From the pharaoh on his throne to the laborer in the sun-baked village, grain dictated the rhythm of daily existence. Ancient Egypt's reliance on grain was tightly linked to the Nile. Each year, the river rose and fell in a predictable cycle, depositing rich silt across the floodplains. This silt, thick with nutrients, made the soil incredibly fertile, ideal for growing wheat and barley. The Egyptians called these grains emmer and barley, and they were the staples of life. Though by modern standards, the diet might seem monotonous and, frankly, bland. Bread, made from emmer flour, was a central part of almost every meal. And barley was the base for beer, which was consumed more as a staple than a luxury. The process of growing grain was painstaking and required careful timing. Farmers worked in shifts, often beginning with the sowing season in midwinter, following the inundation of the Nile. Fields had to be ploughed and fertilized with mud from the river, seeds scattered by hand, and weeds meticulously removed. Irrigation was rudimentary. Canals and basins helped direct water, but it was still a gamble. One poor flood could destroy crops, while an excessive flood could drown seedlings. The Egyptians were acutely aware of this dependence, and religious rituals often centered around invoking the favor of the Nile and the gods who controlled its waters. Once harvested, grain became the foundation of daily life. The typical bread of the peasantry was coarse, dark, and filled with bits of chaff, far from the soft, white loaves we associate with modern bakeries. Baking was usually done in small clay ovens, and fuel consisted of dried reeds or animal dung. These ovens rarely reached high temperatures, resulting in bread that was dense and sometimes slightly sour due to natural fermentation. Though the bread was essential for sustenance, it was rarely enjoyable by taste alone. Flavor came from what could be added: a few grains of salt, a drizzle of honey, or occasionally, some herbs. But for the most part, it was functional, a vehicle for calories rather than a culinary delight. Barley, on the other hand, played a more interesting role. Beer was ubiquitous, not as an indulgence, but as a dietary necessity. Unlike bread, beer provided hydration and nutrition, particularly for workers who spent long hours under the blazing sun. Brewing was a domestic or small-scale operation, involving soaking barley, malting it, fermenting, and finally straining the liquid into jars. This beer was cloudy, thick, and low in alcohol, content more of a gruel than a drink, and often flavored with dates or herbs to mask the sourness. Drinking beer was essential for survival, providing calories and nutrients that bread alone could not supply. Grain also structured society in ways that might seem mundane, but were vital. Taxation was assessed in terms of grain. Workers were paid in rations of bread and beer, and the storage and redistribution of grain was central to maintaining the state's stability. Granaries were monumental structures, not for show, but out of necessity. They had to store vast quantities to survive years of poor harvests or famine. Workers in these granaries meticulously measured, recorded, and safeguarded supplies, an immense bureaucratic system that underpinned the pharaoh's power. Yet, for all its centrality, grain was also a source of anxiety. One particularly bad flood or a locust infestation could trigger shortages, threatening the survival of entire communities. Unlike today, where trade networks can mitigate famine, the Egyptians were largely dependent on local harvests. In these moments, the monotony of daily bread became a sharp reminder of human vulnerability. You might find yourself sitting in a small mud brick home, staring at a lump of bread and a mug of beer, acutely aware that the same sustenance that keeps you alive could, in times of scarcity, be the limit of your existence. The social implications of grain consumption were also quietly profound. The pharaoh enjoyed bread sweetened with honey and shaped into decorative forms, while peasants received a simple, coarse loaf. These subtle differences reinforced social hierarchies without the need for grand proclamations. Even the act of eating was codified. Workers were often fed at central distribution points, where attendance was recorded and the exact quantity of bread and beer carefully measured. This seemingly mundane system created a structure of control and dependency, shaping behavior through daily routines that, by today's standards, would appear mind-numbingly ordinary. What is perhaps most fascinating, from a modern perspective, is how grain and its derivatives infiltrated not just the stomach, but the imagination. Egyptian art, religion, and mythology frequently reference grain. Offerings of bread and beer were made to gods, ensuring the favor of divine forces over crops and harvests. Funerary texts describe the importance of grain in the afterlife, so that the deceased might never go hungry. The humble loaf was elevated to a symbol of sustenance and divine protection, demonstrating that even the dullest of daily staples could carry immense cultural weight. And yet, for all its centrality, the act of eating remained remarkably uniform and unremarkable. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were often indistinguishable. Bread, beer, and perhaps a small accompaniment of onions or lentils. Meals were functional, quiet, and repetitive. From our perspective, this might seem dull, almost sleep-inducing, but it reflects a truth about human civilization. Survival often lies not in luxury or flavor, but in consistency, reliability, and the careful management of resources. The ancient Egyptian diet, with its relentless focus on grain, embodies this principle perfectly. As the sun set over the Nile, casting long shadows over the harvested fields, the workers might rest, consuming the daily rations that would sustain them for the next day's labor. Children learned early to recognize the smell of fermenting dough, the taste of coarse bread, and the slight bitterness of barley beer. It was a life dominated by the unglamorous but indispensable work of feeding oneself and one's community. And in this quiet, repetitive existence, there is a subtle lesson. Civilization itself is built not on the extraordinary, but on the boring, painstaking regularities that allow humans to survive and endure. But one question lingered in the minds of the Egyptians, whispered in the quiet of the granaries and the fields. What would happen if the river failed them, if the floods didn't come, or the grain failed to grow year after year? Could their society endure the monotony and fragility of a life so intimately tied to a single staple? The answer was uncertain, and it is this uncertainty that would shape the next phase of Egypt's complex relationship with its daily bread. The dependence on grain in ancient Egypt was not simply a matter of survival. It became a delicate balancing act between human effort, divine intervention, and the unpredictable rhythms of nature. By the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 BCE, the administration of grain had evolved into a sophisticated and, by modern standards, astonishingly bureaucratic system. Grain was collected, measured, and redistributed in a manner that resembled a state-operated economy more than the casual food systems of earlier societies. Peasants brought their harvests to local officials, who meticulously recorded quantities on clay tablets, often using hieroglyphic notations and tally marks. These tablets, preserved in dry granaries and archives, are some of the few glimpses we have into the mechanics of ordinary Egyptian life. The grain itself was stored in massive silos, constructed from mud brick and sometimes reinforced with reed mats to prevent moisture damage. Workers carefully monitored these silos, scooping out daily rations for laborers and redistributing the surplus to temples, the royal household, or other bureaucratic arms of the state. To imagine this today, picture row upon row of nearly identical mud brick towers, each filled with grain and constantly under the watchful eye of administrators who ensured that nothing was lost or stolen. For the laborer, the significance of grain was immediate and tangible. Most Egyptians were employed in seasonal work along the Nile, repairing canals, building temples, or constructing tombs. Their compensation was rarely coins or gold. It was bread, beer, and perhaps a small portion of vegetables. This rationing system created a rhythm to daily life. A laborer would wake before dawn, begin long hours of work under the punishing sun, and consume modest quantities of bread and beer throughout the day. The monotonous taste of coarse, sour bread and thin beer was accepted not with pleasure, but with necessity. Yet even in this mundanity, the Egyptians displayed ingenuity. They learned to stretch the caloric value of grain, mixing it with water, legumes, and occasionally spices to increase nutrition. Fermentation, soaking, and repeated baking techniques were not culinary experiments, but survival strategies perfected over centuries. Grain also dictated the social and religious calendar. Festivals, feasts, and even funerary rituals were organized around agricultural cycles. The inundation of the Nile was celebrated with offerings of the first grain, and the harvest was often accompanied by ceremonial meals for officials and priests. These events were carefully documented, demonstrating that food, while seemingly mundane, was central to the spiritual and political life of Egypt. A granary tablet might detail how many jars of beer were provided to the temple workers during a festival, or how much bread was set aside for offerings to the gods. Every loaf had a purpose, and every ration was counted. Despite the state's careful management, grain shortages were inevitable. Egypt's reliance on the Nile was both a blessing and a curse. Years of insufficient flooding could trigger famine, while excessive inundation could destroy crops entirely. Archaeological records, including skeletons with signs of malnutrition and mass burial sites, suggest that periods of scarcity were not uncommon. During these times, bread became the center of anxiety. Officials would adjust rations, sometimes drastically, to preserve the stability of cities and maintain order. In some cases, famine led to social unrest. In others, it forced innovation. People experimented with alternative grains, wild vegetables, and legumes, trying to compensate for the failures of wheat and barley. The mundane task of grinding grain by hand became a lifeline, and even small increases in efficiency could save lives. It is tempting to imagine ancient Egyptians enjoying their bread and beer with contentment, but the reality was often less pleasant. The physicality of daily labor, combined with the blandness of food, made for a diet that was functional at best. Archaeologists have found evidence of dental wear and disease caused by the grit in coarse bread, and digestive complaints likely plagued much of the population. Yet, these hardships were accepted as part of life. Surviving in Egypt meant accepting the monotony of bread, the thinness of beer, and the repetitive rhythm of agricultural labor. Life was dictated not by indulgence, but by reliability and resilience. The hierarchy of grain consumption was also stark. While peasants endured coarse bread and low-alcohol beer, the elite enjoyed more refined versions, made from sifted flour and sweetened with dates or honey. Special molds created ornate shapes for royal banquets, where the aesthetic of bread became part of the ceremony. Yet even in these settings, the focus remained on sustenance and display of wealth rather than culinary innovation. The same grain that nourished peasants underpinned the luxury of the elite, reinforcing the idea that the mundane, unglamorous work of farming fed not just bodies, but entire social structures. Over time, the administration of grain became increasingly sophisticated. Pharaohs appointed overseers to monitor production, distribution, and storage, and meticulous records ensured that nothing was wasted. Tax collection in grain meant that officials needed to understand seasonal yields, river patterns, and labor availability. This attention to detail created a surprisingly resilient system. Even during poor harvests, stored grain could sustain urban populations and prevent widespread famine, at least temporarily. It is a testament to human ingenuity. The dull, repetitive work of accounting, measuring, and distributing grain became a cornerstone of societal stability. In a way, the boring history of bread and beer was also the history of civilization itself. Yet, even with careful planning, the Nile could be merciless. In years when the floods were insufficient, famine threatened the social order. Records from the First Intermediate Period, around 2200 BCE, describe widespread hunger, abandoned settlements, and a dramatic decline in public works. Archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions pleading for grain from neighboring regions, evidence that the Egyptians were painfully aware of their dependence on a single staple. The anxiety surrounding grain shaped politics, influenced migrations, and even dictated warfare. Control of fertile land and access to the Nile's bounty were as critical as any military campaign. While today we may marvel at monumental temples and the grandeur of the pharaohs, these achievements were built on the quiet, monotonous labor of sowing, harvesting, and distributing grain. And yet, in the daily monotony of grinding wheat, baking bread, and drinking sour beer, there existed a subtle resilience. Generations of Egyptians endured, innovated, and adapted. They developed methods to stretch limited resources, built systems to protect against famine, and integrated food into every aspect of culture, from religion to law to architecture. Even the humblest worker, consuming a dense loaf of bread in the shade of a mud brick granary, participated in a grand, interwoven system that sustained a civilization for millennia. It is remarkable, from a modern perspective, how such ordinary routines formed the backbone of an empire. As you imagine the repetitive rhythms of ancient Egyptian life, the same fields, the same loaves, the same jars of beer, day after day, there is an inevitable question that arises. Could such a fragile, grain-dependent society withstand a truly catastrophic failure of the Nile? If the river's floods ceased for several years in a row, could the bureaucracies, granaries, and social structures endure? Or would the very staple that sustained millions instead become a source of collapse, revealing the precariousness hidden beneath the apparent stability of daily bread? By the time ancient Egypt reached the New Kingdom, roughly 1070 BCE, the systems surrounding grain had become a central feature of statecraft, religion, and social organization. The pharaoh's authority was not measured solely by armies or monuments, but by his ability to manage this basic yet vital resource. Grain was, in essence, both the lifeblood and the quiet pulse of Egyptian civilization. To understand the implications of this, we must consider the ways in which grain influenced survival, politics, and even cultural memory. The New Kingdom pharaohs invested heavily in granaries, ensuring that the state could withstand periods of scarcity. These granaries were far from simple storage spaces. They were carefully designed structures with ventilation channels, mud brick insulation, and monitoring systems to prevent spoilage. Officials known as scribes of the granary meticulously recorded every sack of grain, every ration distributed to workers, and every contribution made to temples. These records, often preserved on papyrus, provide us with remarkable insights into the scale of administration and the quiet, meticulous labor that kept Egypt functioning. In other words, civilization thrived not through grand gestures alone, but through repetitive, methodical attention to what might seem mundane: counting, measuring, and safeguarding grain. The people, however, experienced this system on a much more personal and immediate level. Daily life remained structured around bread and beer. Even at the height of empire, a laborer's day began with a loaf of coarse bread and a small portion of beer, perhaps accompanied by onions, leeks, or lentils. Cooking remained largely utilitarian, grinding grain by hand, baking it in clay ovens, and brewing beer using slow fermentation. These routines, unremarkable to an outsider, were essential survival mechanisms. One can almost hear the rhythm of daily life: the grinding of stones, the clatter of baking molds, the bubbling of fermenting barley, and the low murmur of workers exchanging news while sharing their rations. It was a life of quiet endurance, a rhythm that persisted for generations. Yet, no matter how refined the administration, the threat of famine never fully disappeared. Records from the New Kingdom indicate years of partial crop failure, when the Nile did not rise to its expected levels. During these times, rationing became stricter. Bread and beer were carefully weighed, and the state's reserves were put to the test. Interestingly, the Egyptians developed adaptive strategies, such as storing surplus grain from exceptionally bountiful years, diversifying crops with legumes and flax, and importing food from neighboring regions when possible. These measures were practical, even boring in their simplicity, but they were essential for preserving the social fabric. Civilization often hinges on such mundane foresight rather than heroic battles or dramatic events. The religious dimension of grain also intensified. Bread and beer were not just nourishment, they were sacred offerings. Temples received constant contributions of grain, which fed priests, maintained rituals, and symbolized divine favor. Funerary practices included placing bread and beer in tombs to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The grain that sustained life was also thought to sustain eternity. This duality, both physical sustenance and spiritual significance, underscored the centrality of bread and beer in Egyptian consciousness. Ordinary people may have found their diet monotonous, but in doing so, they participated in a larger cultural and religious framework, binding their labor to cosmic and divine order. Still, life remained precarious. Archaeological evidence reveals that periods of famine led to population stress, malnutrition, and sometimes social unrest. One striking example comes from the First Intermediate Period, where inscriptions lament abandoned fields and starving populations. Such crises were reminders that the mundane acts of sowing, harvesting, and measuring grain were fundamentally fragile, contingent upon the cooperation of nature and the skill of administrators. A society built on grain required both meticulous management and a measure of luck, a lesson perhaps lost on those imagining ancient Egypt as a realm of uninterrupted grandeur. The New Kingdom also demonstrates how grain created resilience through repetition. By institutionalizing the production and distribution of bread and beer, Egypt ensured continuity. Generations of workers, scribes, and laborers maintained the system, even when faced with political upheaval or environmental challenges. This continuity was perhaps the most remarkable feature of Egyptian civilization. The unglamorous work of planting seeds, grinding flour, and brewing beer became a stabilizing force that allowed monumental architecture, complex hierarchies, and religious traditions to flourish. Civilization itself depended upon the boring reliability of grain. In reflecting on this history, it becomes clear that what may seem mundane, the texture of coarse bread, the sourness of beer, the meticulous recording of granary accounts, was in fact extraordinary in its consequences. Grain shaped the rhythms of life, the organization of society, and even the spiritual imagination of the Egyptians. Bread and beer were not just food, they were instruments of survival, symbols of authority, and threads connecting generations. Civilization endured because suffered ordinary people committed to the repetitive, precise, and ultimately life-sustaining work of feeding themselves and each other. As the sun sets on this chapter of Egyptian history, one is left with a thought that lingers quietly. The stability of great civilizations may rest not on conquest, art, or wealth, but on the boring, persistent work of daily survival. The grain that nourished millions, the bread that filled mouths day after day, the beer that quenched thirst under the relentless sun. All of these mundane details were the foundation of one of history's most enduring societies. And yet, we are left with a haunting question. Could a civilization so intimately tied to a single staple survive in the long term without continuous oversight, foresight, and a measure of fortune? The answer, buried in the sands of the Nile, reminds us that even the most ordinary things can shape the extraordinary arc of history. If you imagine the dining table of a pharaoh, you might conjure up images of golden plates heaped with exotic foods, lavish spreads of meat, and wines so fine they seem almost unreal. But the reality of Egyptian cuisine, at least the part that truly sustained daily life, was far more mundane repetitive, and surprisingly modest. The flavors that defined the table of even the highest-ranking nobles were familiar, earthy, and often dull by modern standards. Salt, beer, onions, leeks, and occasionally fish or fowl. It was not the extravagance of flavor but the structure of consumption, the reliability of sustenance, and the subtle hierarchy of taste that mattered most. Salt, for instance, was everywhere. Not the fancy, refined salt you find in contemporary kitchens, but coarse, crystalline salt harvested from the edges of lakes and marshes. Egyptians prized it for both practical and symbolic reasons. Practically, it preserved food, particularly meat and fish, which spoiled quickly under the relentless heat of the Nile Valley. Salted fish, for example, could be stored for weeks, feeding workers and soldiers alike. It also flavored bread dough and other staples, compensating for the blandness of grains. Symbolically, salt had connections to purity, ritual, and preservation qualities that extended even to mummification practices, where natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and salt, helped preserve bodies for eternity. So, in the most ordinary meals, the same substance that flavored a loaf of bread or fish also carried echoes of religion and survival. Beer, however, was the star of everyday consumption, and not just for the elite. Unlike wine, which was reserved for special occasions or religious ceremonies, beer was the primary beverage of the masses. It was thick, cloudy, and sometimes gritty, the product of fermented barley that had been soaked, mashed, and strained into clay jars. Low in alcohol compared to modern standards, beer functioned more like a nutritional supplement than a recreational drink. A laborer's daily ration could easily include multiple liters, providing hydration, calories, and essential nutrients. The flavor was sour, yeasty, and slightly bitter, with occasional sweet notes if dates or herbs were added. It was an acquired taste, one that Egyptians accepted as part of the fabric of life. For the pharaoh, beer was also a ceremonial element, often offered to gods and consumed in ritual contexts, reinforcing its dual function as sustenance and spiritual instrument. Onions and leeks were the third constant at the table. While these humble vegetables might seem ordinary, they were deeply intertwined with Egyptian culture and physiology. Onions were believed to contain protective properties, warding off evil spirits and boosting health. They were widely cultivated, cheap, and readily available, making them staples of both peasant and elite diets. The smell of onions and leeks permeated kitchens, markets, and temples alike. They were boiled, roasted, or eaten raw, often added to bread, dough, or soups to provide a subtle flavor. Their ubiquity and resilience made them essential, not because they were luxurious, but because they endured where more delicate vegetables would fail under the harsh sun. The table of a pharaoh might have included other foods, dried fish, roasted fowl, or occasional fruits such as dates, figs, and pomegranates, but these were embellishments rather than necessities. The central flavors were repetitive: salt to preserve and season, beer to nourish, onions to supplement taste and health. The elite might have access to more refined versions of bread, finely sifted flour, or honey for sweetness, yet even here, the diet remained grounded in staples. Meals were often simple affairs, eaten quickly, with a focus on function over indulgence. It is tempting to imagine grandeur, but in practice, taste was secondary to nutrition, ritual, and social structure. The social hierarchy of taste was subtle, but significant. Peasants and laborers consumed coarse bread, thin beer, and raw onions. Artisans and officials enjoyed slightly refined bread, perhaps sweetened with dates, and more flavorful beer. Nobles and the royal family had access to additional ingredients: fowl, fish, fruits, and honey. The flavors reflected status, and meals functioned as both nourishment and demonstration of social order. In this way, mundane tastes were also political. reinforcing hierarchies through everyday consumption. Cooking methods themselves contributed to the monotony of flavor. Most food was boiled, roasted, or baked in clay ovens. Spices were rare, imported only occasionally from distant lands, making them costly and unusual. Herbs such as coriander or cumin were known but used sparingly. Preservation techniques, salting, drying, fermenting were necessary under the hot Egyptian sun, but did not enhance flavor in the way modern cuisine might. Instead, they reinforced the functional purpose of food: to last, to sustain, to nourish, and, in some cases, to offer to the gods. Even the banquets of pharaohs, often imagined as opulent affairs, revolved around familiar tastes. Bread and beer were served in decorative molds. Onions, leeks, and lentils accompanied roasted fowl. Fish was salted and sometimes spiced. Meals could be long, ceremonious, and visually elaborate, yet the palate was never challenged by complexity. What mattered was quantity, symbolism, and the rhythm of consumption. The flavors of daily life, salt, beer, onions, remained constant, tying the lofty ceremonies of royalty back to the laborers in the fields and workshops who subsisted on the same basic elements. These mundane flavors also influenced medicine, ritual, and longevity. Beer and onions were thought to have health benefits, strengthening the body and promoting resilience. Salt preserved not just food, but also health and spiritual integrity, and the simple, repetitive nature of meals reinforced predictable energy and nutrition. Egyptians did not seek culinary excitement. They sought reliability, endurance, and the quiet assurance that their bodies would continue to function under harsh environmental conditions. The tastes may have been dull, but their significance was immense. Yet, there remained an ever-present tension between abundance and scarcity. The reliability of these flavors depended on agricultural success, trade, and political stability. A poor harvest could make even these basic tastes a luxury. Bread might be coarser, beer thinner, and onions in short supply. Food became a marker not just of status, but of security. The mundane elements of salt, beer, and onions could, in times of scarcity, highlight the fragility of life itself. And so, as you imagine the quiet flavor of an Egyptian meal, the sour tang of beer, the earthy sharpness of onions, the briny preservation of salt, you begin to sense the profound, yet understated role these tastes played in history. They were not indulgences, but instruments of survival, ritual, and social cohesion. Even in their monotony, they were vital, shaping behavior, reinforcing hierarchy, and ensuring continuity across generations. And yet, a lingering question remains. For all the careful management of staples and ritualized consumption of salt, beer, and onions, could this diet truly sustain a society in moments of crisis? What happened when the river faltered, the granaries ran low, or a famine swept the land? The answer is not simple, and it is a question that echoes through the muted flavors of history, quietly waiting for the next chapter to reveal its consequences. While the flavors of ancient Egypt, salt, beer, and onions might appear mundane, their significance extended far beyond taste. These staples were embedded in the rhythms of labor, the rituals of religion, and the delicate balance of state control. The everyday act of eating was a complex intersection of nourishment, survival, and social organization. And it is through this lens that we can begin to understand why the boring details of flavor mattered so profoundly. Bread and beer, as we've seen, were the pillars of Egyptian sustenance. But their production was not trivial. Brewing beer required knowledge, patience, and careful observation. Barley had to be soaked in water, allowed to germinate, then dried, ground, and fermented in large clay jars. The resulting liquid, thick and often sour, was strained and consumed in quantities that modern drinkers would find astonishing. Workers might drink several liters a day, relying on beer for hydration, calories, and even minor nutritional content. Despite its unappealing taste, Beer was a cornerstone of daily survival. More than a beverage, it was sustenance, ritual, and currency rolled into one. Salt, equally mundane in appearance, played a surprisingly multifaceted role. In addition to preserving fish and meat, it was used to season bread, extend the shelf life of vegetables, and maintain hygiene in kitchens and storage areas. Salt had symbolic and religious significance as well, often incorporated into offerings to gods and in funerary rituals. Its omnipresence in food meant that almost every meal carried an implicit connection to preservation, both physical and spiritual. Even a simple loaf of bread or a piece of dried fish symbolized the broader Egyptian emphasis on stability and endurance, demonstrating that the dullest elements of flavor could carry extraordinary weight in culture and ritual. Onions and leeks, though humble, were remarkably resilient crops. They thrived in conditions where other vegetables struggled, and their ubiquity reflected practical necessity rather than culinary preference. Egyptians valued them for flavor, nutrition, and medicinal properties. Onions were believed to improve eyesight, promote strength, and protect against disease. Leeks were thought to aid digestion and boost endurance. These properties were not anecdotal. Papyri, from medical texts, including the Ebers Papyrus, describe treatments involving onions, leeks, and garlic for a variety of ailments. In this way, everyday flavors doubled as a functional pharmacy, demonstrating a practical, unromantic approach to food that combined diet, medicine, and superstition. The social impact of these flavors was subtle but pervasive. Ordinary laborers consumed bread made from coarsely ground emmer flour, thin beer, and raw or boiled onions. Artisans and officials had slightly more refined versions: bread made from finer flour, beer that was richer and occasionally flavored with dates, and vegetables combined into simple stews. The elite, including pharaohs and high-ranking nobles, enjoyed even further refinements: honey-sweetened bread, roasted fowl, salted fish, imported fruits, and occasional spices. Yet even the elite diet centered on the same basic flavors, reinforcing continuity between classes, while still signaling status through quantity, quality, and presentation. Food was both ordinary and socially charged, mundane, yet integral to hierarchy. Cooking techniques, too, influenced flavor and survival. Egyptians relied primarily on boiling, roasting, and baking, using clay ovens fueled by reeds or animal dung. Spices were rare and mostly imported from regions such as Punt, Syria, or Nubia, making them luxuries rather than staples. Preservation strategies, salting, drying, fermenting, were critical under Egypt's hot climate. Bread had to last, beer had to sustain workers, and vegetables had to endure transport and storage. What might strike a modern observer as bland was, in reality, a sophisticated adaptation to environmental, social, and logistical constraints. Religion, too, intertwined with taste. Every temple received regular contributions of bread, beer, and vegetables, which were consumed by priests, used in offerings, or stored for ritual purposes. Funerary texts describe loaves and jars of beer placed in tombs to sustain the deceased in the afterlife, highlighting the belief that these mundane flavors had eternal significance. Meals were both physical and spiritual acts. The simple taste of an onion or the sour tang of beer was inseparable from the larger cosmology that governed Egyptian life. Even the seemingly boring flavors of daily sustenance carried profound symbolic meaning. The practical and ritual roles of these foods often collided during times of scarcity. When the Nile failed to flood adequately, grain harvests suffered, and with them, bread and beer supplies. Salted fish and vegetables might become the only accessible food for many, particularly the urban poor. Rationing became stricter, and administrators carefully calculated distributions to maintain social order. Elite households sometimes faced only minor adjustments, but for laborers and artisans, these shortages could mean thinner loaves, weaker beer, and fewer onions. The monotony of taste became more acute during crisis, and the dull, repetitive flavors that once sustained life now underscored its fragility. Interestingly, scarcity prompted creativity. Even within the limitations of flavor, ancient texts record substitutions, barley or lentils, added to bread to stretch supplies, herbs used to enhance weak beer, and small amounts of imported fruits distributed to elites. Cooking was never glamorous, but it was adaptive, demonstrating resilience through practical experimentation. The boring flavors that dominated daily life became a tool for endurance, as Egyptians continuously refined how to make modest resources sufficient for survival. The daily repetition of these tastes also reinforced social and cultural cohesion. Workers in granaries, artisans in workshops, and priests in temples all shared the same basic diet. In this shared monotony, social hierarchies were maintained not only through differences in quality, but also through ritualized patterns of distribution. Bread, beer, and vegetables tied the empire together, creating a system in which labor, status, and religion were interconnected through food. The ordinary flavors of salt, beer, and onions became a binding mechanism, linking survival to culture, hierarchy, and belief. Yet, one question lingered quietly in the background. Could a society so dependent on these mundane, repetitive flavors, so reliant on a small set of staples, endure a prolonged crisis? If floods failed repeatedly, if disease struck crops, or if administrative systems faltered, would salt, beer, and onions be enough to sustain the complex web of labor, ritual, and governance that held the empire together? The Egyptians had engineered a delicate equilibrium, one built on monotony, repetition, and meticulous oversight. But the resilience of a civilization rooted so deeply in the boring yet essential flavors of daily life was far from guaranteed. And so, as you imagine the sour taste of beer, the sharp bite of onions, and the briny tang of salt in every meal, you might begin to appreciate how the ordinary, the seemingly dull, could dictate the extraordinary. These flavors were not indulgent, they were essential, shaping survival, hierarchy, and ritual. And yet, the question remains, echoing across millennia: could the mundane sustain a civilization when faced with nature's uncertainty? The answer, as with much of history, is as complex and nuanced as the grains and herbs that flavored the daily lives of the Egyptians. By the time of the New Kingdom, the seemingly mundane flavors of ancient Egypt, salt, beer, and onions, had become foundational pillars of daily life, ritual, and governance. The pharaoh's ability to ensure a steady supply of these staples was as much a measure of power as the size of his armies or the height of his temples. These flavors, humble though they were, held the Egyptian world together. Bread was not merely food. Beer was not merely a drink. Onions and leeks were not merely vegetables. Together, they formed a system of sustenance that bound laborers, priests, artisans, and rulers into a tightly knit social and religious fabric. The laborers who tilled the fields or built monumental structures relied on bread and beer to fuel their efforts. Even the coarsest bread, dense and gritty, with bits of chaff, provided calories, while beer thick, sour, and slightly bitter quenched thirst and supplemented nutrition. Salt preserved fish and meat, ensuring that protein could reach those far from the river, and onions provided a small but steady supply of vitamins, minerals, and medicinal properties. In this way, the ordinary flavors of daily life were inseparable from survival itself. Without them, the Egyptian state, built on labor, administration, and monumental architecture, would have collapsed. For the elite, the flavors were refined, but not fundamentally different. Bread could be sweetened with dates or honey. Beer might be enriched with herbs or fermented more carefully to improve taste. Vegetables could be stewed or roasted for added variety. These refinements reinforced status, yet even pharaohs remained connected to the same fundamental staples as the lowest laborers. Ritualized consumption of bread, beer, and onions during religious festivals, offerings to gods, and funerary practices reinforced the sacred significance of these tastes. What might seem boring to modern palates carried profound spiritual, social, and political weight. Even with careful management, the Egyptians remained vulnerable to scarcity. Historical records attest to periods of famine when the Nile failed to flood adequately. Crops were ruined by pests, or disease struck granaries. During such crises, the boring flavors of salt, beer, and onions became markers of anxiety. Bread grew thinner, beer weaker, and vegetables scarce. The elite often fared better, but no one was entirely immune from the consequences of environmental unpredictability. These moments underscore the fragility of a civilization built on the ordinary, reminding us that stability is always contingent, even when systems appear robust. Yet, the Egyptians demonstrated remarkable resilience. The bureaucracy that managed grain and beer, the methods for preserving fish and vegetables, and the careful planning of agricultural cycles allowed society to endure despite environmental uncertainty. Scarcity prompted innovation, blending legumes into bread, experimenting with new fermentation techniques, and developing storage methods for long-term preservation. The boring flavors of daily life became a canvas for adaptation, a measure of ingenuity, and a testament to human persistence. Survival depended not on extravagance, but on the steady repetition of simple acts: grinding grain, brewing beer, salting fish, and cooking onions. The broader impact of these flavors extended beyond nutrition. They structured society, reinforced hierarchy, and connected daily life to religion and ritual. Every loaf of bread, jar of beer, or bundle of onions carried layers of meaning. They were tools of governance, instruments of ritual, and symbols of resilience. Through them, the pharaoh exercised control, priests maintained sacred duties, and laborers endured the harsh rhythms of work and climate. Civilization itself depended on what might appear mundane, revealing that history often turns not on extraordinary events, but on the repetition of ordinary acts. By reflecting on the daily flavors of ancient Egypt, one can begin to appreciate the subtle complexity of what might otherwise seem boring. Salt preserved life and order, beer nourished both body and spirit, and onions sustained health and routine. These staples were not indulgent luxuries, but vital threads in the fabric of society. They shaped work, ritual, and survival, creating a system in which ordinary tastes underpinned extraordinary achievements, from the pyramids to sprawling temples to intricate administrative records. And yet, even with all this preparation, a quiet question lingers. Could a society so dependent on these ordinary flavors endure a prolonged and catastrophic failure of resources? What if the Nile failed repeatedly, if granaries became infested, or if political instability disrupted distribution? The mundane staples that had supported Egypt for millennia might suddenly become insufficient. The Egyptians themselves may have asked this question in moments of scarcity, uncertain whether their carefully ordered world could survive the unpredictability of nature. The enduring lesson, however, is clear. Civilization rests not solely on monuments or conquest, but on the boring, repetitive, and necessary acts of survival. Salt, beer, and onions may not excite the modern palate, but they were instruments of endurance, adaptation, and social cohesion. They remind us that history is built as much on the ordinary as on the extraordinary, and that the quiet flavors of daily life can shape the fate of empires. In imagining the sour tang of beer, the briny crunch of salted vegetables, and the earthy bite of onions, one sees not a lavish table, but the foundation of survival, resilience, and continuity. These mundane tastes, repeated day after day across centuries, held together a civilization that endured for millennia. And in that realization, we understand the quiet power of the ordinary, that even the dullest aspects of life, bread, beer, onions, can shape the arc of history in ways both subtle and profound. The Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, was both a generous benefactor and a quiet, unpredictable force. Its annual inundation deposited nutrient-rich silt across the floodplains, transforming arid deserts into fertile fields and sustaining the civilization that emerged along its banks. Yet, this dependence on the river's natural rhythm was a double-edged sword. When the floodwaters came late, failed to reach their full height, or receded too quickly, the consequences were immediate, relentless, and often devastating. Hunger and famine were not distant threats. They were recurring realities that shaped the lives, labor, and governance of ancient Egypt. For the average Egyptian, life revolved around preparing for, enduring, and recovering from the seasonal rhythms of the Nile. Farmers planted seeds with meticulous attention to timing, relying on the river to nourish their crops. The inundation was celebrated as a divine gift, yet it was also the source of profound anxiety. Too little water meant failed harvests, starvation, and economic disruption. Too much could destroy homes, granaries, and farmland. The Egyptians developed methods to predict and manage these risks, watching the river levels, maintaining canals and dikes, and timing agricultural work precisely. But uncertainty remained a constant companion. Grain, the primary staple, bore the brunt of this uncertainty. Emmer, wheat, and barley were highly productive under normal conditions, yet vulnerable to drought, excessive flooding, or pests. A failed harvest meant more than hunger. It threatened social order. Laborers relied on bread and beer for sustenance, and rationing systems had to be adjusted in response to scarcity. Officials maintained detailed records of grain production, consumption, and storage, using their administrative oversight to mitigate the effects of natural fluctuations. Yet, even the most meticulous planning could not fully shield the population from the unpredictability of the Nile. Famine left both physical and psychological marks. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons showing signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, dental disease, and weakened bone structures, evidence of repeated exposure to food shortages. Inscriptions and texts from periods of scarcity describe abandoned fields, empty granaries, and citizens petitioning for assistance. Stories from the first, intermediate period, around 2200 BCE, illustrate the scale of human suffering. Villages deserted, laborers unpaid or undernourished, and officials scrambling to redistribute food. Hunger was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a recurring challenge that shaped Egyptian resilience, ingenuity, and social structures. Interestingly, famine also influenced social hierarchies and power dynamics. The pharaoh, as the ultimate guarantor of abundance, bore responsibility for ensuring that granaries were full and workers fed. When grain failed, it was not only a personal tragedy for those affected, but a political problem for the ruler. Officials used rations, stored surplus grain, and redistributed resources to maintain loyalty and order. The mundane task of measuring bread and beer became a critical instrument of governance. Even the most ordinary food, coarse bread, weak beer, dried onions, served as a lifeline for society and a tool for maintaining power. The Egyptians responded to famine with a mixture of practical adaptation and ritualized supplication. Alternative food sources, wild plants, legumes, fish from the Nile, and even imported grain were incorporated into diets to compensate for shortages. Offerings to the gods intensified, with priests and commoners alike seeking divine intervention to restore the river's generosity. Religious festivals sometimes became opportunities to redistribute food, reinforcing social cohesion while attempting to mitigate the immediate threat of starvation. In this way, hunger intertwined with religion, administration, and daily life, demonstrating that the ordinary act of eating was inseparable from broader cultural structures. Famine also forced technological and agricultural innovation. Egyptians developed sophisticated irrigation systems, digging canals, basins, and dikes to channel floodwaters more predictably. Crop rotation, soil management, and storage techniques improved resilience against variable harvests. Grain silos were reinforced and expanded, and the timing of planting and harvesting became increasingly precise. These adaptations, while unremarkable in narrative excitement, reveal a civilization responding methodically to environmental pressures, demonstrating that survival often hinges on the repetitive, mundane, and carefully executed acts of ordinary life. Yet, despite these efforts, the Nile's unpredictability remained a formidable challenge. Floods could fail for several consecutive years, leaving communities exposed to hunger and social stress. In extreme cases, famine prompted migration, social unrest, or even the collapse of local administrative structures. Archaeological evidence suggests that during particularly severe periods, cities and villages were abandoned, and populations sought refuge elsewhere, illustrating the fragile balance between natural abundance and human survival. The generosity of the Nile was never guaranteed. Life along its banks required constant vigilance, planning, and endurance. The personal experience of famine, too, was deeply human. Imagine a family in a small mud-brick village, relying on the river for crops, watching as waters fail to rise, rationing the remaining bread, sipping weak beer for nourishment, and searching for alternative food sources. Children might go to bed hungry, laborers might work undernourished, and officials might grapple with the bureaucratic nightmare of distributing insufficient rations. Hunger was a daily, relentless presence, transforming the ordinary act of eating into a complex negotiation between survival, social obligations, and the whims of nature. And yet, the threat of famine also fostered resilience. Generations of Egyptians adapted to uncertainty, developing storage methods, alternative diets, and agricultural techniques that allowed society to endure. Communities learned to share resources, redistribute food during crises, and maintain social order despite scarcity. Even the dull and repetitive acts, grinding grain, brewing beer, salting fish, took on extraordinary significance when famine loomed. Civilization depended not on wealth or power alone, but on these persistent, methodical practices that ensured survival in an unpredictable environment. And as the Nile receded and the threat of famine lingered in the minds of the population, an unresolved question hung over the fields and granaries. What if the river failed completely, year after year, leaving no harvest and no rations? Could Egyptian society, with all its careful planning, rituals, and bureaucracies, survive a prolonged collapse of its most vital resource? The answer was unknown, and it is precisely this uncertainty, the fragile reliance on an unpredictable river, that would shape the next chapter of Egypt's struggle with hunger, resilience, and survival. By the Middle and New Kingdoms, the Egyptians had become acutely aware that their civilization's prosperity depended entirely on the Nile's seasonal generosity. The river's floods, depositing nutrient-rich silt across the floodplains, were the source of life, but also a source of constant anxiety. Predictable in timing, yet variable in intensity, the inundation dictated when fields could be sown, when workers could be dispatched to construction projects, and even when religious festivals could be held. Life in Egypt was a careful negotiation with nature, where a delay of even a few weeks could ripple outward into hunger, social stress, and economic strain. Grain, unsurprisingly, remained at the center of this system. Emmer, wheat, and barley were the staples, forming the backbone of bread and beer, which were themselves the primary sustenance of Egyptians, from laborers to the pharaoh himself. Granaries became crucial infrastructure. Enormous mud-brick silos dotted the landscape, serving as both storage and a buffer against famine. Scribes meticulously recorded the inflow and outflow of grain, noting rations given to workers, contributions to temples, and reserves set aside for emergencies. These routine, bureaucratic actions, dry and methodical as they may appear, were the mechanisms by which a society could endure hunger. Famine, when it struck, exposed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Egypt's systems. Archaeological evidence shows repeated patterns of malnutrition and starvation. Skeletal remains indicate stunted growth, dental enamel defects, and weakened bones, suggesting that repeated exposure to food shortages left long-lasting physiological effects. Texts from famine years, often in the form of petitions or records of ration distribution, reveal the social pressure to maintain order even under dire conditions. Local officials had to negotiate ration reductions, redistribute stored grain, and balance the competing demands of the populace. These tasks were mundane, repetitive, and bureaucratic, yet they were life or death work in a civilization built on the delicate interplay of agriculture, administration, and human endurance. The social consequences of famine extended beyond nutrition. When grain became scarce, social hierarchies were both reinforced and tested. The pharaoh, theoretically the guarantor of abundance, bore ultimate responsibility for ensuring that the population did not starve. Officials, in turn, were tasked with implementing rationing schemes, monitoring labor, and maintaining loyalty. Workers' daily rations could be reduced, food distributions delayed, and yet social unrest had to be avoided. In times of scarcity, the ordinary routines of food preparation, measurement, and distribution became instruments of political stability. Hunger, then, was not merely a physical challenge. It was also a test of governance, discipline, and societal resilience. Famine also prompted adaptive strategies that were both practical and surprisingly innovative. Egyptians experimented with alternative foods to stretch supplies. Legumes, wild plants, and river fish became increasingly important. Bread could be mixed with lentils, beer watered down or flavored with dates, and preserved fish and salted vegetables supplemented the diet. These adaptations were rarely glamorous. They were functional responses to environmental stress, but they reveal a sophisticated understanding of resource management. Survival depended not on luxury, but on the effective use of limited materials, and these boring adjustments were central to the endurance of society. Religious and cultural practices intensified during periods of scarcity. Offerings to gods, particularly deities associated with fertility and the Nile, became more frequent and urgent. Rituals were performed to ensure that the floods would return to their proper levels, reflecting the belief that human survival was intertwined with divine favor. Religious leaders played a role in distributing food, providing both practical assistance and moral authority, and reinforcing the social cohesion necessary to weather famine. Even the mundane act of eating bread, beer, and simple vegetables was suffused with ritual significance during times of crisis, demonstrating how culture, religion, and survival were inseparable. The impact of famine extended into migration and labor. Historical records suggest that during prolonged food shortages, villages and towns were abandoned, forcing populations to relocate to areas with more reliable resources. Laborers might abandon large construction projects, artisans might suspend their work, and administrative routines could falter under social strain. These disruptions, while seemingly minor in isolation, had cascading effects across the state. Famine could slow the construction of temples, delay tax collection, and weaken the pharaoh's control over distant regions. In this way, the ordinary struggle to secure food had extraordinary political consequences. Despite these challenges, the Egyptians developed remarkable resilience. The administration of grain, the careful rationing of bread and beer, and the adaptive strategies in food production allowed the civilization to endure cycles of famine. Granaries and irrigation systems acted as buffers, while social rituals and religious observances maintained cohesion. The repetitive, mundane labor of sowing seeds, grinding grain, brewing beer, and preparing simple meals became the foundation upon which the entire society rested. The ordinary, in this case, was extraordinary precisely because it sustained life, maintained hierarchy, and preserved culture over centuries. Yet, the specter of famine always loomed. No matter how meticulous the administration or innovative the adaptations, a prolonged failure of the Nile could challenge the very survival of Egypt. How long could granaries sustain urban populations if drought persisted for several consecutive years? Could the administrative system continue to function under sustained scarcity? Could social cohesion survive when rations were exhausted and fields lay barren? These questions were not theoretical, they were existential, shaping the policies, rituals, and daily work of Egyptians across generations. And so, as you imagine the fields left fallow by insufficient floods, the granaries under close watch, and the laborers rationing thin bread and weak beer, you begin to grasp the quiet tension that shaped ancient Egyptian life. Survival depended on mundane, repetitive acts, careful observation of the river, precise measurement of grain, and the slow, methodical preparation of food. Civilization itself was built on these ordinary routines, yet it remained precarious, vulnerable to forces beyond human control. The enduring question, which would resonate across generations, remains: could the Egyptians, for all their ingenuity and discipline, withstand a catastrophic, multi-year failure of the Nile? And if the river's generosity faltered permanently, would even the most boring, methodical acts of daily survival be enough to sustain one of history's greatest civilizations? The New Kingdom of Egypt, often remembered for its monumental architecture, powerful pharaohs, and elaborate religious ceremonies, rested precariously on the cycles of the Nile. Beneath the grandeur of palaces and temples, the ordinary, repetitive realities of daily survival, sowing seeds, measuring grain, baking bread, brewing beer, were what sustained the civilization. When the Nile flooded as expected, life proceeded with a rhythm both predictable and reassuring. But when the river faltered, hunger and famine reminded Egyptians of the fragility underlying even the most enduring of empires. Famine in Egypt was not a sudden, catastrophic event, but a slow, grinding reality. Early signs were subtle: diminished river levels, smaller harvests, and stressed livestock. Granaries, though well stocked in most years, were depleted gradually as officials rationed supplies to urban populations, laborers, and soldiers. The elite were buffered against scarcity, but for the majority, life became a matter of endurance. Laborers consumed thinner bread, watered-down beer, and whatever vegetables or salted fish remained. Families rationed meals carefully, stretching resources day by day, week by week. In such moments, the ordinary flavors of Egyptian life, salt, beer, onions, and coarse bread, transformed from sustenance into a lifeline. Administrative bureaucracy became a lifeboat in these crises. Scribes recorded every sack of grain, every jar of beer, and every ration distributed. Officials made daily calculations, predicting how long reserves would last and determining which regions should receive priority. These mundane acts of measurement, tallying, and distribution were not bureaucratic indulgences, they were central to the survival of society. History often celebrates rulers for their triumphs, but in Egypt, the quiet labor of granary administrators determined whether people lived or starved. Civilization itself, in this sense, was held together by dull, repetitive acts that required diligence, foresight, and patience. Famine also intensified the connection between food and religion. Egyptians believed that the favor of the gods influenced the Nile's generosity. When waters failed, rituals and offerings increased. Temples became centers of both spiritual and practical intervention. Priests oversaw the distribution of food, organized communal meals, and participated in ceremonies designed to restore divine favor. Bread and beer, so ordinary in daily life, took on sacred significance, linking survival to cosmic order. In times of scarcity, even the simplest meal was both nourishment and prayer, sustaining body and spirit simultaneously. The social consequences of famine were profound. Starvation threatened social stability, and officials worked tirelessly to prevent unrest. Disputes over rations, abandoned fields, and migration pressures tested local governance. Laborers might be undernourished, slowing construction projects or leading to temporary cessation of work on monumental temples. Artisan workshops could falter, affecting production of everyday goods and ceremonial objects. The ordinary act of feeding a population became inseparable from the maintenance of political, economic, and religious structures. Hunger was not merely physical, it was a stressor on every dimension of Egyptian society. Yet, despite these recurring crises, Egypt endured. Granaries, irrigation systems, and adaptive agricultural techniques provided a buffer against shortfalls. Communities innovated, substituting legumes for grains, relying on river fish, and preserving vegetables through salting and drying. Religious rituals reinforced communal solidarity, offering both spiritual reassurance and practical redistribution of resources. The repetition of ordinary acts, planting, harvesting, grinding, baking, brewing, created resilience. Civilization thrived not because of extravagance or sudden genius, but because the boring, persistent routines of daily survival were executed faithfully, generation after generation. The lessons of famine in Egypt also resonate in broader terms. The reliance on a single staple grain highlighted the fragility of even sophisticated societies. Stability depended on natural cycles, careful administration, and communal cooperation. The mundane rhythms of life, the sour tang of beer, the gritty texture of bread, the earthy bite of onions, were not merely flavorless rituals, they were the threads holding together a complex civilization. Through these ordinary acts, the Egyptians demonstrated that survival often relies on perseverance, methodical planning, and adaptation, rather than heroic or dramatic interventions. Yet, history is rarely entirely reassuring. Extended periods of famine could and did destabilize regions, force migrations, and reshape social and political landscapes. While the Egyptians developed remarkable resilience, the threat of multi-year failures of the Nile remained an ever-present tension. Granaries might empty, bureaucracies might falter, and communities might be forced to relocate or abandon their traditional way of life. The ordinary staples that had once secured survival could suddenly become insufficient, reminding us that even enduring civilizations are vulnerable to the relentless unpredictability of nature. And so, as you imagine the quiet life of the Nile Valley, the repetitive grinding of grain, the slow brewing of beer, the careful rationing of bread and onions, you begin to see how ordinary routines shaped extraordinary outcomes. The survival of Egypt depended on these mundane practices, repeated meticulously over generations. The mundane became heroic, the ordinary became essential, and the boring details of daily life were what allowed one of history's greatest civilizations to persist for millennia. And, yet, the question lingers as it must have for the Egyptians themselves. If the river had failed entirely for several years, if granaries were exhausted, and if social cohesion faltered, could even the most methodical, boring acts of survival have been enough to save the civilization? The answer remains unknown, hidden in the depths of history. But the lesson is clear. Sometimes, it is the dull, persistent, and ordinary that determines the fate of the extraordinary. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often picture towering pyramids, colossal statues, and grand temples. But beneath these iconic symbols of power and grandeur lay a far less glamorous, yet absolutely essential aspect of Egyptian civilization: bureaucracy. For the state to survive, thrive, and maintain control over a population spread along hundreds of miles of the Nile, someone had to keep track of resources, labor, and daily transactions. This responsibility fell largely to scribes, whose work, though seemingly tedious, was the backbone of Egyptian administration. Scribes were highly trained professionals, skilled in reading and writing hieroglyphs, hieratic script, and later, demotic script. Their education was rigorous, often beginning in childhood, and involved memorization of hundreds of symbols, their sounds, and their complex uses in various contexts. Far from being mere pen pushers, scribes were the ultimate information managers of their time. They recorded grain deliveries, beer rations, livestock counts, land surveys, tax obligations, and temple offerings. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every bundle of onions and leeks that sustained society passed through their meticulous calculations. The workday of a scribe was repetitive and exacting. They sat on low benches or mats, surrounded by papyrus scrolls, ink palettes, and reed brushes. Their task was not creative storytelling, but precision in recording and calculation. One day could involve tallying grain harvested in a particular nome province, noting the amounts sent to temples, and calculating rations for workers. Another day might focus on tax collection, recording payments in kind grain, beer, livestock, rather than currency. Every entry had to be exact, for a mistake could mean misallocation of resources, unpaid workers, or insufficient offerings to the gods. Precision, patience, and routine were the scribe's most vital tools. Bureaucracy was deeply intertwined with survival. The state relied on its scribes to maintain records that ensured workers were fed, projects were supplied, and the pharaoh could project authority across a vast territory. Granaries and storehouses were managed using meticulous ledgers. Officials referenced these records when distributing rations, paying laborers, or preparing for potential shortages. The mundane, repetitive act of recording numbers had enormous consequences. The pyramids and temples we admire today were built on the invisible foundation of these administrative calculations. Without scribes tracking every sack of grain and every ration, the workforce would have been disorganized, hungry, and ineffective. Hieroglyphs themselves were complex and visually striking, but their function was primarily utilitarian in administrative contexts. While monumental inscriptions in temples and tombs celebrated pharaohs and gods, the everyday script used by scribes was highly efficient. Designed for rapid recording, hieratic, a simplified cursive form of hieroglyphs, allowed scribes to write quickly on papyrus, wood, or ostraka, pottery shards. Demotic, developed later, streamlined the script even further for commercial and legal purposes. These innovations were not artistic, they were functional, designed to maintain order and efficiency across the administrative machinery of the state. The life of a scribe was privileged in some ways, but socially constrained in others. Scribes enjoyed higher social status than common laborers, had anevrios, access to education, and could secure positions in temples, courts, or provincial administrations. Yet, their work was monotonous and exacting, leaving little room for creativity or variation. Mistakes were not tolerated, and the social expectation for precision created constant pressure. A single miscalculation could disrupt grain distribution or provoke complaints from workers. The scribe's reward was status and influence, but it came at the cost of repetitive, meticulous labor. Scribes also acted as intermediaries between the pharaoh, the central government, and the local population. When a harvest failed, or a flood disrupted the annual cycle, they calculated shortages, redistributed grain, and adjusted labor rations accordingly. Their records provided the data necessary to prevent famine, maintain loyalty, and uphold social order. The work was quiet, tedious, and invisible in the grand narrative of Egyptian history, yet it was fundamental. Civilization, in this sense, was less about monumental architecture than about the invisible, boring systems that kept the population alive and organized. Religion and bureaucracy intersected as well. Temples maintained their own records of offerings, land holdings, and laborers, often coordinated by scribes. The pharaoh's authority, reinforced through ritual and divine association, relied on these administrative routines. Without scribes documenting temple assets, labor obligations, and ritual supplies, religious institutions could not function effectively, and divine favor, as interpreted by priests, might be jeopardized. Every loaf of bread offered to a god, every jar of beer poured in ritual, depended on the mundane accuracy of scribe-led record-keeping. Even outside granaries and temples, scribes were crucial to trade, diplomacy, and taxation. Letters, contracts, and legal records were carefully written and archived, allowing the state to manage interactions with neighboring regions and maintain internal order. These documents, often dry and repetitive, were the tools by which Egypt extended its influence, managed resources, and preserved continuity over centuries. Monuments may have celebrated conquest and power, but the real authority flowed through numbers, lists, and calculations maintained by the scribes. And yet, the work of these scribes also raises an unresolved curiosity. Could such a system, dependent on meticulous, human-managed record-keeping, survive in moments of crisis or mass disruption? What if granaries overflowed with grain but clerks failed to record it properly? Or if laborers and officials lost confidence in administrative accuracy? The balance between survival and failure was delicate, hinging on the boring but essential labor of writing, calculating, and recording tasks that seem mundane but were, in fact, the very foundation of civilization. As you imagine the quiet offices of scribes, the constant scratching of reeds on papyrus, and the careful counting of grain, beer, and onions, you begin to appreciate that history is not built solely on battles, monuments, or spectacular events. It is built on invisible, repetitive acts on paperwork, record-keeping, and routine labor that quietly shape the destiny of empires. The mundane is, in fact, indispensable, and the survival of Egypt depended as much on the boring work of scribes as on the grandeur of pharaohs. And so, one question lingers, quietly echoing through the corridors of history. How much of what we admire in ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the monumental inscriptions was possible only because of the unglamorous, repetitive work of scribes? Could the empire have endured without these invisible administrators, meticulously tracking every loaf of bread and every jar of beer? The answer, like much of boring history, lies in the tedious, persistent details that rarely make it into our stories, but are crucial for survival. By the height of Egypt's new kingdom, the bureaucracy was a complex, multi-tiered system, stretching from the grand temples of Thebes to the tiniest villages along the Nile. The scribes were the linchpins of this network, responsible for managing the flow of resources, labor, and information across a civilization that spanned hundreds of miles. Their work may appear monotonous to the modern eye, rows of numbers, lists of rations, and repetitive calculations. But it was central to maintaining order, sustaining labor forces, and ensuring that the machinery of the state functioned smoothly. Granaries were the most obvious focus of their labor. Scribes meticulously recorded the intake of grain from harvests, noting quantities, quality, and origin. Each granary held detailed ledgers, tracking how much had been stored, distributed, or reserved for future use. When famine threatened or floods disrupted the annual cycles, these records became life or death documents, guiding the redistribution of food to workers, soldiers, and urban populations. A single miscalculation could mean empty stomachs, abandoned fields, or social unrest. The boring, repetitive act of counting grain was in reality a powerful form of control, directly influencing survival and societal stability. Beer, too, fell under the purview of scribes. Laborers depended on daily rations of this thick, slightly sour beverage, which provided both hydration and calories. Records documented the production, storage, and distribution of beer, ensuring that workers in quarries, fields, and construction projects remained nourished. These calculations were detailed and exacting. Barley quantity, fermentation time, storage capacity, and rationing schedules were all meticulously noted. The pharaoh's monumental projects, temples, tombs, and pyramids relied on this seemingly mundane management. Without scribes tracking the beer rations, workers would have faltered, and the grand constructions we admire today may have remained incomplete. The administration extended far beyond food. Scribes oversaw land surveys, measured taxes in grain, beer, and livestock, and maintained records of labor obligations. They documented legal disputes, contracts, and transfers of property. This extended bureaucracy created a web of accountability that reinforced the pharaoh's authority and connected distant provinces to central governance. Though tedious in execution, These records ensured the smooth functioning of a civilization that would have been unmanageable without written oversight. Religion was deeply entwined with bureaucracy. Temples were not only spiritual centers, but economic and administrative hubs, holding vast tracts of land, livestock, and wealth. Scribes recorded offerings, monitored temple production, and tracked the labor of priests and temple workers. Ritual observances often required precise quantities of bread, beer, and other goods, which had to be prepared, counted, and distributed according to tradition. The scribes' work, though invisible to the public eye, ensured that religious practices could continue uninterrupted. In many ways, the survival of the gods' favor, at least as interpreted by priests, depended on the boring precision of administrative record-keeping. Education for scribes reinforced this meticulousness. Training began in childhood and involved memorizing hundreds of hieroglyphic signs, mastering numerical calculations, and practicing careful penmanship on papyrus and ostraca. Mistakes were unacceptable. Errors in a ledger could provoke punishment, while accuracy elevated status and opportunities. Scribes often spent decades refining their skills, producing detailed, repetitive, and painstaking work that formed the backbone of the state. Their labor was unspectacular, yet indispensable. Without scribes, Egypt's administrative systems, and by extension its civilization, could not function. Famine, environmental stress, and political instability revealed the delicate dependence on bureaucracy. When grain failed or floods were irregular, scribes were responsible for calculating ration reductions, reallocating resources, and maintaining trust in the administration. Records guided labor deployment, controlled economic outputs, and mediated social tension. Any disruption in record-keeping could exacerbate crisis, showing that the empire's strength rested not just on armies or monuments, but on disciplined, boring, and repetitive administration. Trade and diplomacy also relied on meticulous documentation. Letters, contracts, and inventories ensured that resources flowed smoothly between regions, including international exchanges with Nubia, Punt, and the Levant. Scribes recorded imports, taxes, and shipments with painstaking detail. Even small errors could disrupt supply chains, highlighting the critical importance of precision. The boring work of writing, counting, and recording, therefore, had consequences far beyond local granaries. It shaped the economy, international relations, and even the pharaoh's ability to maintain authority. Yet, despite the sophistication of the bureaucracy, one tension remained ever present: human error and the limits of capacity. Scribes were skilled, but mortal. Clerks could miscalculate, records could be lost, and oversight could fail. In moments of crisis, famine, rebellion, or flood, the very system that sustained Egypt could be exposed as vulnerable. How much could the empire rely on repetitive, human-managed record-keeping when environmental, political, or social pressures pushed the system to its limits? The mundane work of administration, though essential, was simultaneously fragile, revealing the precarious balance upon which the civilization rested. And so, as you imagine the quiet lives of scribes, the repetitive strokes of hieratic on papyrus, the endless rows of numbers, the meticulous monitoring of grain, beer, and labor, you begin to see the extraordinary power of the ordinary. Civilization was not built solely on grand visions, wars, or monuments. It was sustained by the tedious, repetitive, and exacting work of individuals whose labor ensured that Egypt functioned, survived, and endured. The empire's might, in other words, rested on the invisible backbone of bureaucracy. And yet, an unresolved question persists. In moments of extreme crisis, when famine, flood, or social unrest converged, could the human-managed bureaucracy continue to hold together the vast machinery of the Egyptian state? Or would the empire falter, revealing the limits of even the most disciplined, boring, and meticulously executed work? The grandeur of ancient Egypt, the towering pyramids, the vast temples, the colossal statues, often overshadows the less glamorous reality that held the civilization together, its bureaucracy. Behind every monumental achievement, every successful harvest, and every functioning temple, there were scribes, clerks, and administrators executing meticulous, repetitive, and boring work that ensured the survival of the state. Without them, Egypt's power, culture, and society might have unraveled long before it reached its historic heights. By the New Kingdom, the bureaucracy had evolved into a vast, hierarchical system. At the top, viziers and high officials oversaw administration for the entire kingdom, coordinating with provincial governors to monitor grain, labor, taxes, and temple contributions. Beneath them were scribes, responsible for detailed record-keeping, counting grain, tracking beer production, logging temple offerings, and documenting labor assignments. Even minor errors could cascade into shortages or misallocated labor, emphasizing the extraordinary importance of ordinary, methodical tasks. Civilization depended on these routine, repetitive acts as much as on armies or monumental architecture. Granaries and storehouses were carefully managed through detailed ledgers maintained by scribes. The system was designed not only for efficiency, but for resilience. Records allowed officials to anticipate shortages, redistribute rations, and deploy labor effectively during times of stress. Beer and bread rations were calculated daily, ensuring that workers constructing temples, tombs, or irrigation systems were fed. Even the distribution of onions and leeks, mundane foods for daily survival, was meticulously recorded, ensuring a functional workforce. These repetitive tasks, though seemingly dull, were critical to maintaining both social stability and state productivity. Religion intersected seamlessly with administration. Temples managed their own resources: grain, livestock, laborers, while scribes documented every offering, every ration, and every ritual requirement. Pharaohs, priests, and administrators relied on these records to ensure the gods were properly honored. Offerings were not symbolic alone. They required actual food and goods, carefully measured and accounted for. Thus, the 12, ordinary work of bureaucrats had spiritual, cultural, and practical consequences, reinforcing the essential role of tedious administration in the functioning of society. Famine and environmental unpredictability tested the limits of this bureaucracy. When floods were insufficient or harvests failed, the meticulous records of grain reserves and ration distributions became crucial tools for survival. Scribes calculated reductions in rations, prioritized distribution to critical laborers, and monitored the flow of goods to prevent unrest. These mundane calculations became instruments of resilience, allowing Egypt to endure periods of scarcity. Yet the system was not infallible. Human error, unexpected disasters, or breakdowns in communication could have disastrous consequences, revealing the fragility inherent even in such an organized, meticulous structure. The role of scribes also extended into trade and diplomacy. Egypt imported exotic goods, incense, gold, cedarwood, spices from regions such as Punt and Nubia. Scribes meticulously recorded shipments, taxes, and agreements, ensuring that trade networks functioned smoothly. Contracts, letters, and legal documents governed commercial and political interactions, connecting distant regions to central authority. Without these careful, repetitive administrative acts, economic and diplomatic stability would have been compromised. Once again, the survival of Egypt relied on the mundane precision of bureaucratic labor. The labor of scribes, though repetitive, was a source of continuity and cultural preservation. Records maintained over centuries allow modern historians to reconstruct the daily life, economic practices, and administrative mechanisms of ancient Egypt. These mundane documents, lists of grain, ration logs, temple inventories, reveal more about survival, governance, and resilience than many monumental inscriptions. They show that civilization thrives not only through spectacular achievements, but also through the persistent, ordinary work of individuals committed to accuracy, consistency, and detail. Yet, despite its sophistication, the bureaucracy was always at the mercy of human and environmental limits. What would have happened in the event of a catastrophic, multi-year failure of harvests, widespread disease, or administrative collapse? Could the empire's intricate network of records and calculations hold together under extreme pressure? Or would the state falter, revealing that even the most disciplined, boring labor has its limits? These uncertainties underscore the delicate balance upon which ancient Egyptian civilization rested. And so, as you imagine the quiet offices of scribes, the scratching of reeds on papyrus, and the endless rows of numbers meticulously recorded, the true power of the ordinary becomes apparent. History is rarely shaped solely by monumental events or dramatic figures. It is often the repetitive, mundane, and invisible labor counting, recording, calculating that sustains society. The New Kingdom endured, not merely because of pharaohs or armies, but because the boring work of scribes ensured survival, order, and continuity across centuries. The invisible backbone of Egypt, the hierarchy of scribes and administrators, reveals a profound truth. Civilization relies on the persistent execution of ordinary acts. Without them, empires collapse, monuments fall into ruin, and history's narrative becomes chaotic. The hieroglyphic bureaucracy was Egypt's lifeline, an extraordinary testament to the power of the mundane. And in reflecting on this, one must ask, how many other civilizations have risen and fallen because the invisible, boring work of daily administration succeeded or failed? When we imagine ancient Egyptian armies, we might picture vast phalanxes of soldiers marching into battle, wielding spears and shields beneath the blazing sun. But beneath the surface of conquest and glory lay a far less glamorous reality, the monotonous, repetitive, and often grueling daily life of the average soldier. Soldiers were not only warriors, they were laborers, craftsmen, and administrators in uniform, whose survival depended on discipline, routine, and the boring realities of military organization. Understanding this daily grind is essential to appreciating how the Egyptian state maintained its power both internally and abroad. The backbone of the army was the infantry, recruited from various social classes, often serving as part-time soldiers during peacetime. Life for these men was regimented. They drilled daily, practicing formations, weapon handling, and marching long distances. These drills, repetitive and physically demanding, were essential for maintaining readiness. The training was not glamorous marching with heavy equipment, polishing weapons, and performing endless maneuvers in the desert. Heat formed the bulk of military life. Glory in battle was rare. Survival and competence in routine tasks were far more critical. Supplies, logistics, and food were constant concerns. Soldiers were issued rations of bread, beer, onions, and occasionally salted meat or fish, similar to what ordinary laborers received. Rations were calculated carefully to sustain energy during marches, construction projects, and campaigns. Administrators, often the same bureaucratic scribes who managed granaries, tracked the distribution of provisions. Soldiers depended on these mundane supplies. Without consistent rations, morale and efficiency would plummet. The ordinary act of eating, therefore, became a crucial pillar of military strength. Life in the pharaoh's army was not solely about combat. Soldiers often doubled as laborers, constructing fortifications, digging canals, maintaining roads, or even assisting with temple building projects. These tasks were repetitive and physically demanding, and they required cooperation and discipline. Survival in the army depended as much on enduring these tedious labors as on surviving combat. The rhythm of military life, march, drill, labor, eat, sleep, created a structured routine that reinforced hierarchy and cohesion within units. Discipline was strictly enforced. Officers monitored drills, ration distribution, and labor tasks. Infractions were met with punishment, ranging from extra labor to corporal penalties. These measures, though monotonous and often harsh, ensured order and reliability. Soldiers had to internalize the repetitive routines of camp life, weapon maintenance, and labor assignments, understanding that individual failure could jeopardize the entire unit. In this way, boredom itself became a tool of endurance, conditioning soldiers to persist through discomfort and tedium. The mundane realities of military campaigns were equally challenging. Long marches across the desert required careful planning and organization. Soldiers carried provisions, weapons, and sometimes construction tools, often moving in precise formations under the watchful eye of officers. Travel could take days or weeks with the same repetitive routines. March at dawn, pause for rest, eat the same rations, set up temporary shelters, and maintain weapons and equipment. These ordinary patterns ensured survival in harsh environments, where even minor missteps could lead to dehydration, illness, or death. Health and hygiene were constant concerns. Soldiers were exposed to extreme weather, poor sanitation, and the risk of injury from labor and combat. Preventative care included daily washing in the Nile or canals, basic treatment of wounds with medicinal plants, and careful rationing to avoid malnutrition. Even the most mundane aspects of life, staying clean, repairing sandals, preparing food, had direct consequences for military readiness. The extraordinary feats of battle were thus underpinned by the repetitive and unglamorous labor of daily survival. The army was also a microcosm of Egyptian society. Soldiers were organized hierarchically, with clear chains of command, divisions based on skill and experience, and specialized roles such as archers, charioteers, or engineers. This structure, while seemingly rigid, relied on the boring work of daily administration, tracking troop assignments, maintaining equipment inventories, and recording rations. Scribes often accompanied armies, documenting movement, provisions, and labor, ensuring that even on campaign, the mundane mechanisms of survival and efficiency were upheld. And yet, amidst the repetition and tedium, there were moments that highlighted both resilience and fragility. A poorly organized march could exhaust troops, a miscalculated ration could lead to starvation, and the slightest lapse in discipline could have catastrophic consequences during combat. Soldiers understood that survival did not come from dramatic heroics alone, but from the relentless execution of ordinary routines. Training, drilling, rationing, and labor were the true foundation of military effectiveness. The army's dependence on mundane survival strategies also shaped broader society. Military campaigns relied on the same logistics, granaries, and administrative networks that supported ordinary laborers, artisans, and temple workers. Soldiers were both protectors and participants in a system sustained by repetition and bureaucracy. Their survival and the state's ability to wage war or enforce authority depended on the invisible, boring work of daily life: eating, marching, drilling, and maintaining equipment. Without these routines, Egypt's military might would have crumbled, revealing that endurance often outweighed valor. And so, as you picture soldiers marching under the hot sun, sharing thin loaves of bread, sipping weak beer, performing drills, and laboring on construction projects, the extraordinary dependence on the mundane becomes clear. Egypt's military power, like its monumental architecture and sprawling bureaucracy, was time, sustained by boring repetition, discipline, and meticulous planning. The heroic battles that history remembers were possible only because of these invisible, ordinary routines. Yet, a lingering question remains. Could an army, no matter how disciplined, survive prolonged campaigns if supply chains faltered, granaries emptied, or environmental conditions became extreme? The answer was uncertain, and the survival of Egypt's military often hinged not on battlefield skill, but on the boring, repetitive, and unglamorous work that ensured soldiers remained fed, hydrated, and organized. By the New Kingdom, Egypt's military had evolved into a sophisticated, well-organized force capable of projecting power beyond its borders. Yet, the extraordinary accomplishments of conquest, defense, and expansion relied on an infrastructure as boring as it was essential. Meticulous logistics, precise rationing, and disciplined labor. Soldiers were not constantly engaged in glorious combat. The vast majority of their time was consumed by preparation, travel, and routine labor tasks, as crucial to victory as skill with weapons. Long campaigns demanded careful planning. Armies traveled hundreds of miles across desert, river, and floodplain, often moving at a snail's pace compared to modern expectations. The pace was dictated not by ambition, but by the practicalities of survival. Daily rations had to be sufficient, water sources located and utilized efficiently, and rest periods scheduled to maintain stamina. Soldiers carried supplies, tents, and tools for digging fortifications, ensuring that the army could establish secure camps along the way. Marching, setting up camp, rationing, and maintaining equipment were repetitive but necessary acts that prevented exhaustion, illness, and desertion. Provisioning the army was a monumental, boring challenge. Scribes and quartermasters documented rations with precision. Bread, beer, onions, dried fish, and salted meat were distributed according to calculations based on body weight, exertion level, and campaign length. These seemingly mundane calculations were essential. Without them, soldiers could fall ill, lose morale, or abandon their posts. The army's success depended on such meticulous planning, proof that military strength was as much about arithmetic, observation, and routine as it was about courage or strength in battle. Training remained a constant, repetitive feature even on campaign. Soldiers drilled daily to maintain discipline, practice formations, and ensure unit cohesion. Archers honed their accuracy. Infantry practiced spear thrusts and shield blocks, and charioteers rehearsed maneuvers in coordination with the rest of the army. These drills were tedious but necessary. Without repetition, the chaos of battle would quickly overwhelm even the most courageous soldiers. Survival depended on mastery of simple routines executed over and over. Under extreme heat or on barren desert terrain, health was a continuous concern. Exposure to the sun, limited sanitation, and the physical strain of marching and labor created constant risk. Soldiers treated minor injuries with herbal remedies, repaired torn clothing and sandals, and ensured that water supplies were uncontaminated. These mundane survival practices were the invisible underpinnings of military effectiveness. A campaign could succeed or fail, not because of bravery alone, but because soldiers were able to survive the harsh conditions imposed by the environment and the routine demands of daily life. Despite their harsh routines, soldiers had social structures that provided stability and cohesion. Units were organized hierarchically, with officers monitoring adherence to orders and maintaining discipline. Roles were specialized. Some men acted as scouts, others as engineers, and some handled supplies. Even within this hierarchy, the repetitive tasks, drilling, counting rations, maintaining equipment, reinforced social cohesion. The boring routines were the mortar holding the unit together, allowing soldiers to trust one another, obey orders, and function collectively in conditions that would otherwise produce chaos. Military campaigns also relied on local populations and bureaucracy. Grain, water, and other provisions were drawn from villages along the route, often requiring negotiation and record-keeping. Administrators and scribes accompanied armies, documenting every ration distributed and every labor allocation made. This overlap between military and civilian administration underscores the dependence of soldiers on the mundane work of logistics. The grandeur of conquest the cities captured, the borders expanded, was only possible because the boring, repetitive routines of rationing, record-keeping, and marching were executed faithfully day after day. The psychological dimension of military life cannot be overlooked. Soldiers endured extreme monotony, punctuated by brief moments of danger or excitement. Waiting for orders, marching under a relentless sun, and performing laborious camp duties could weigh heavily on morale. Boredom was a constant adversary, rivaling any external threat. The capacity to persist through tedium, to maintain discipline and focus, was as important as physical fitness or weapon skill. Repetition, predictability, and routine, often perceived as boring, became survival tools, shaping the endurance and cohesion of the army. And yet, the system was fragile. Famine, disease, miscalculated rations, or disorganization could disrupt campaigns and threaten the lives of soldiers. Long supply lines were vulnerable, and the margin for error was small. Even the best trained, most disciplined troops could falter if logistics failed or environmental conditions became extreme. The success of Egypt's armies rested on the boring, unglamorous acts of planning, rationing, drilling, and labor tasks, often overlooked in historical narratives, but absolutely essential for survival and victory. By examining the repetitive, structured life of Egyptian soldiers, one begins to see how empire was maintained through routine rather than heroics. Daily survival, discipline, and coordination allowed armies to march hundreds of miles, endure extreme conditions, and achieve strategic objectives. The extraordinary feats of battle and conquest rested on the repetitive, invisible work of preparation, sustenance, and labor, boring, perhaps, but indispensable. Yet, even with this rigor, one lingering question remains. If supply chains failed, if environmental extremes persisted, or if discontent spread among troops, could the pharaoh's army continue to function effectively? Or would even the most disciplined soldiers succumb to the relentless monotony and hardships of campaign life? This uncertainty, the ever-present tension between preparation and catastrophe, sets the stage for the final section of the story, where the consequences of military endurance, fatigue, and logistical strain come to light.